Welcome to Short Takes on Geography with Dr. Lisa Benton-Short, Professor of Geography at the George Washington University and Chief Reader of Advanced Placement Human Geography. This discussion series is brought to you by the American Geographical Society, the foremost champion of geography for the benefit of society since 1851. We now return to Dr. Benton-Short's conversation with Dr. Lee Schwartz, Geographer of the United States, already in progress.
One of the things I want to do is to move on and talk about borders, because all geographers know around political geography that borders are incredibly important, yet also very complex. And I thought we might start with a couple of maps just to get you talking about the role of borders and some of the issues that you've had to deal with in the Office of the Geographer. So let me show you the first map I have is Afghanistan and Pakistan. Can you talk about some of these interesting border issues?
Sure, this is a good example of what I was referring to earlier about the fact that all borders need to be revisited, and we have a process of doing that based on priorities. In this case, the situation in Pakistan and Afghanistan a few years ago was obviously a priority. And another thing we've done recently in our office, about 10 or 12 years ago, was we made all of our international boundaries and boundary data unclassified and fully shareable. And why is that important? Well, just because the United States considers a boundary to exist in a certain place and in a certain line, a certain location, doesn't mean that the countries themselves might have the same boundary or necessarily respect those boundaries. And in this case, we mapped very diligently the Durand line that was done during British colonial rule, but that in fact has never been accepted by either the Afghanistan or Pakistan government. And they also have not necessarily revealed their detailed boundaries and shared that with the world, or even with countries that were engaged in war on their doorsteps. And we were losing, we were having conflicts along the border because the boundaries weren't well known. Well, by making those boundaries publicly available and available to the warring parties, there wouldn't be a misunderstanding as to where, in this case, the coalition troops were patrolling, regardless of whether that boundary was respected by the Pakistanis or the Afghanistanis. And this is an example of, at one point, we made 17 corrections in the boundary we had drawn based on greater information, satellite imagery, digital accuracy. And we're in the process of doing this worldwide. We actually recently just revised the boundaries between NATO countries and Russia where they intersected.
So let me show you this. It's a satellite image, and I think this is what you're talking about in terms of some of the newer technology being able to really help you be more precise with borders. So can you talk a little bit about what we're looking at here?
Right, exactly. When we didn't have accurate surveys or people on the ground, and we had to use say some older imagery that wasn't as detailed, we many times would have a boundary line that would follow, in this case, a different ridge line that wasn't the top of the ridge that the treaty had determined was the boundary. And that map existed on our boundary on our boundary line for many years. At certain scales, it wouldn't matter because the thickness of the line would be, maybe 50 meters or 75 meters wide. But if people, if you got real bullets flying on both sides of the boundaries, it matters to be more precise. And in this case, with new satellite imagery and not using old, stereo imagery that wasn't as accurate, we actually adjusted the boundary because the treaty in this particular location said the boundary followed the ridge, and previous maps had it on a different ridge that wasn't the highest point. And that happens also when rivers change course. As you know, older rivers meander, and if the treaty is based on the river, the question comes into account. If the two countries don't have their own agreement, what are they respecting as the boundary? The river, because it was decided, because that's where the treaty had determined it, or if they've demarcated it and they put it down where the old river had flowed, and that was an agreement as to where the river was, then that is where the boundary exists, even though the river's changed its course.
That's a really great reminder that even just a few feet of difference can make a difference in terms of tension and potential for conflict. Here's another map I wanted you to maybe talk about in terms of borders and some of the ways in which mapping these borders has prevented conflict.
Yes, this was a process that we worked supporting some of the negotiations that were being led by the United Nations when the newest independent state of South Sudan was formed, and the boundary that had been a vestige of the British rule, and in this case dated back primarily to 1956, but even to earlier efforts that were done to determine this boundary, had never been officially determined or delimited or demarcated. And so the parties had to get together and in each segment of the boundary agree upon a new line. And in this case, they couldn't come to an agreement on every portion of the boundary, but most of the boundary was agreed upon, and much of it has been demarcated, with certain segments of it that are still disputed and remain to be worked out in a peaceful way. And as you see, the Abyei region there, that was particularly problematic and still remains indeterminate because of seasonal migrations that took place between what is now the north and the south, where herders would bring their herds across what is the notional boundary line, depending on where the grasses were growing in what season, and that migration was allowed to continue under certain criteria while the parties are continuing to negotiate a permanent boundary.
Well, I'm struck by the fact that all this started in 2011, and that there still are some issues about the borders that remain unresolved, which is a great illumination on the fact that borders can take a very long time to go through the political process of being demarcated and then accepted by both parties, right?
Sure, and I didn't even mention the fact that so many refugees were returning from the Democratic Republic of Congo to former Southern Sudan, now an independent state of South Sudan, and they were coming back with sometimes 10 or 15 times the cattle that they left with, and because cattle represents wealth there, and they were coming to settlements which could no longer support them because of climate change and other sustainability issues, with populations from other tribes that might have moved in. And so the potential for conflict was not something that was unforeseen, even after the South Sudan gained its independence.
Yeah, let's turn to another one I know that's been in the news on and off over the last few years, and that is, how are we going to deal with some of the claims around the South China Sea?
Yes, and this issue has been going on for a while, like you said, but continues because the Chinese have first of all made a claim in the South China Sea that goes contrary to international principles for maritime delimitation, and have claimed all of the islands and many of the features in the South China Sea that, under international norms for how maritime boundaries are depicted, actually belong to the neighboring states and their continental shelves and the territories that are formed by each of the features that you see. So not only do we have to determine whether something is an actual island or merely an undersea feature, and the distinction is whether they are drying or above water at the 17-year average low tide, or high tide rather, which is a little bit tricky to figure out in and of itself. But the Chinese, as I think most of you probably know, are building structures on these undersea features that do not normally qualify as islands. And why is that important? Because if they are officially islands, then they generate their own maritime limits, and that has to be factored into the very complicated matrix of various different claims by all the different maritime countries, not to mention some of the navigational challenges.
It doesn't sound like the South China Sea is going to have any resolution anytime soon.
No, indeed.
All right, I want to move to another type of border issue, and that is that some of what your office does is actually map things like the diffusion of diseases. Can you talk a little bit about that as a border issue?
Sure. I think the fun thing, I guess it's probably the first time anybody's associated Ebola with fun.
The interesting thing.
The interesting fact about something like infectious disease is is while we tend to collect our data and map events based on boundaries, whether they be international boundaries or local level boundaries, something like infectious diseases don't know or don't respect boundaries. Obviously, they don't respect the authority I have in the United States for picking international boundaries, and that can be problematic. It can be problematic because neighboring governments may not get along that well to tackle something like this collectively. It can be problematic because different organizations are operating within the confines of their own international boundaries, and the data they put together may not be the same or be organized the same as data in another state. So we actually have a sort of little project we work on calling Borders Without Boundaries to show that things like disease and, importantly, political conflict don't respect boundaries. And in fact, so not only are boundary disputes often the cause for an international conflict, but they also make it challenging to view and to intervene because the conflicts themselves tend to spread between boundaries of two or more states.
Right. And I'm also thinking about this map, which really shows kind of and highlights some of this issue around borders and disease. You want to speak about this map?
Sure. I think what this really shows is the importance of scale. The previous map was, several different countries and looking at Ebola as something that was spreading differentially internationally and had potential even to leave West Africa and migrate, if you will, to other countries. Whereas this shows just the same type of challenges and problems within the Democratic Republic of Congo itself. And you see the Congo River there, and that's a vector for the spread of many disease. In this case, it's a transport vector, but something like cholera actually is waterborne, and so you need to understand the various different ways disease is spread by various different types of vectors, whether it be aspirations out of people when they're speaking or touching liquids, or it be an insect-borne disease or a waterborne disease. So you need to drill down and understand the scale to really explore the impact of diseases on local populations.
It also seems to me that this kind of a map has value in also providing information on kind of the uneven outbreaks and allowing government and health officials to really target certain areas where intervention is probably most important given the number of cases.
Absolutely, and because we're supposed to be talking a little bit about political geography here, the places where diseases tend to spread the most is where you have lack of effective government control, and you may have militia activity, which not only prevents interventions from being effective, but if you have a lack of effective governance, you have a breakdown in public health systems, and so there's a direct relationship between conflict and the spread of disease and the difficulty of treating it.
Thank you for joining us for this segment of Short Takes on Geography with Dr. Lisa Benton-Short. Be sure not to miss the continuation of Dr. Benton-Short's conversation with Dr. Lee Schwartz, Geographer of the United States. And tune in for this and more great geography teaching resources at AmericanGeo.org. Until next time.